Love, Philosophical, Theological, Psychological Investigations. Session 7, The Intoxication of Love, as outlined by Robert Johnson's book, We, Understanding the Psychology of Romantic Love. Robert Johnson was one of the first students of Carl Jung to study to become a Jungian analyst. Over the years of his successful practice, he also published the books you may have seen, She and He, which dealt with the psychology of women, the psychology of men, respectively, from Jungian perspectives. And his book on We sought to engage a Jungian interpretation of romantic love. This follows our discussion of Peck last week, who also was critical of the tendency in the West to sacralize romantic love. Johnson says, romantic love is the single greatest energy system in the Western psyche. In our culture, it has supplanted religion as the arena in which men and women seek meaning, transcendence, wholeness, and ecstasy. You recall I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, just listen to a pop song. If you take that pop song and you sing it to another person, it's not really psychologically healthy. If you take that same song and pretend that you're singing it to God, then it becomes healthy. So human beings have a tendency to project our religious strivings onto another person as if that person can complete us, as if that person can quell the desire for unity that all human beings fundamentally seek, that desire for communion. Now, I'm not saying, and Johnson would, that we don't need people, but that we confuse this romantic love for religious love, and he'll focus on this religious journey as an inward spiritual journey. And he was very much into an introverted exploration of one's unconscious psyche. And I highly recommend his book, his autobiography, Balancing Heaven and Earth. I don't read a lot of books multiple times, but that book is, I've read it about 4 or 5 times. In fact, going through this material again has kind of inspired me to read it again. Fascinating journey he has. But he really, as someone who never married, really has a lot of insight into romance. We don't know much about his personal life. And I'll say something more towards the end about, as someone who, in my own studies, I visited the Jung Institute, was considering taking their training before I went into the academic world, and have since become a little bit critical of the Jungian approach. But I still think when you compare it to Freud, the advantage to Jung is that he takes it more seriously. He takes religious dimension more seriously. Johnson goes on to say, we are the only society that makes romance the basis for marriages and love relationships and the cultural ideal of true love. Now, I will leave that to you all to consider. Is this true for Westerners? And I'm thinking North America and for the most part, the US and Canada, which was the context that Johnson was operating in. He explores the ancient myths of Tristan and Iseult. In part 1, he summarizes part 1 as really capturing the eradication and repression of the divine feminine in Western patriarchal society, and even suggests that with the suppression of the Catharist heresy, which came about in the Middle Ages, one of the things that was lost in that was the divine feminine. And we've never been able to really recover that. So, this tendency to see the Queen of Ireland in this myth as evil is associating that with the repression of the feminine in the West. And so one of the things that he's going to encourage in his writings is that we try to recover that. And you recover that by going inward. In the second part, he outlines the intoxicating power of love. When Tristan and Isolde accidentally drink the love potion, they fall hopelessly in love with each other. Now, one of the things that Johnson doesn't emphasize here is it's forbidden. And sometimes forbidden love can be so enticing, intoxicating, and it can be so destructive. Oh, this happens. We see you may know people that this has happened to. And when you confuse the inner desire for God with that and displace that onto a human being, it can be very destructive. It's a kind of idolatry. And I can think of some examples of people I know in my own life, but maybe you can think of people in your own life and just look at the consequences of it. In part 3, Tristan and Isolde practice deception, and that leads to alienation. They end up living in poverty out in the wilderness. And Johnson basically says that this deception is all part of this confusing the inner for the outer. He says we need individuality, and we also need relationship to a particular person. So if we confuse the inner with the outer, we can displace, we can conflate our need for individuals with our need for God. And so a healthy relationship will acknowledge the need for individuality, but will also acknowledge the need for another person. And we're not, no one is an island, as the story goes. In part 4, we see that which kind of anticipates Shakespeare's romantic Romeo and Juliet, the self-destruction of this kind of love, that it really just doesn't go anywhere, as intoxicating as it can be. So Tristan and Isolde have given us a warning about how romance, when displaced, can go down the wrong path. But there's another thing in here. The two Isoldes in part 4, there's the earthly Isolde and the more heavenly Isolde. Tristan has projected on Isolde the fair, the heavenly anima, and that has led him to a path of destruction. He's rejected the more earthly Isolde of the fair hands, who was probably a more adequate partner, but he didn't see it because he was all starry-eyed. The grass is always greener on the other side, which leads to a desolation in relationships. Of course, he asked the question, will I never find someone to heal me of my unhappiness? That's the error. Trying to find it outside. As it's been said, happiness is an inside job. Somebody can't complete me or heal my happiness. And you see, this is part of the mistake that the West has drank this love potion. They've put their hope in this love potion. And the myth of Tristan and Iseult is that this is a wrong way path. In his concluding reflections on the Bison Woman, when in Lakota mythology, when someone disrespects that, it brings destruction. When they honor it, it brings proper health and psychological balance. And then Johnson closes with his own dream of restoring the bell in the church of named after the Mother of God. And Johnson slips out the side door in this dream. And this was a significant dream for him because he recounts it in his biography as well. And it just led me to think that Johnson also have something to do with the recovery of the feminine in the West, which might help us balance this distorted mythology we have around romance. Because until we properly integrate the feminine philosophically and theologically into Western Christianity, are we going to be more apt to displace that energy inappropriately onto other people and perpetuate this myth of love? And thank you, Johnson, for giving us an occasion to reflect on this profound psychological power of the myth of romantic love.